The principal let out a mocking laugh the moment he saw the substitute teacher step into the classroom, while behind her the school's most feared student cracked his neck and spat on the floor. The room was plunged into a strange, almost hostile silence. The fluorescent light flickered, casting irregular shadows on the scratched desks. The smell of dried sweat and cheap disinfectant filled the air. The woman, in a simple blazer and worn briefcase, stopped before the class, her eyes scanning faces with invisible emotional scars. Her breathing was steady, but her hands betrayed nervousness, fingers gripping her bag's handle tightly. "She won't last a week," someone muttered from the back, drawing muffled laughter. The boy in the left corner stared at the new teacher like a wounded animal stares at someone trying to help, suspicious, ready to bite. But she didn't back down. And that's where everything began to change. David was 16 years old, but looked older. Or maybe it was just the look, that kind of look that had already seen too much and given up on almost everything. His curly hair, unkempt, partially covered his face. Always in a dark hoodie, even in the heat, as if he wanted to hide. But few knew that hoodie wasn't just a fashion choice. It was armor. At home, fights between his parents echoed through the thin walls of their apartment in the housing projects. His father, when he showed up, came home late and drunk. His mother worked double shifts as a janitor and returned too exhausted for questions or conversations. In the middle of it all, David learned that being invisible was safer. At school, he discovered that being feared was even better. Every day, he arrived late and alone. Teachers avoided confrontation. Classmates feared him or ignored him. The nickname Ghost stuck fast. He didn't correct anyone. In fact, he seemed to like it. But nobody knew that, hidden at the bottom of his backpack, among torn books and scribbles, there was a notebook with sentences written in pencil, thoughts, stories, song lyrics. A universe of his own, where he still existed. That morning, he found something different stuffed in his pencil case, a note. 3 words written in blue pen with firm handwriting. "I see you." He looked around, not knowing who had put it there. For the first time in a long time, he felt something strange. Hope. Lincoln High School was known for its discipline problems and peeling walls. The gym served more as a fighting ring than a space for physical education. The older teachers were tired. The new ones, terrified. The school functioned like a sick organism. The hallways echoed with screams, cruel laughter, and the constant shuffling of discouraged feet. Classrooms were disputed territories between students who wanted to learn and those who had already given up. The courtyard was divided into groups: the popular kids, the invisibles, the troublemakers, and the misfits. It was Monday, and the Chicago winter wind blew through the corridors, breaking the silence between classes. The sound of sneakers dragging, desks slamming, distant shouts. The vice principal, absent, the counselor, exhausted. And the principal? Cynical, sarcastic, and without any faith in that place. Behind the scenes, staff whispered about the school's lost causes. David was always mentioned, not just for his indiscipline, but for what everyone perceived: wasted intelligence, talent suffocated by revolt. The substitute arrived without fanfare. Name: Ms. Susan Rodriguez. Calm steps, eyes that seemed to see beyond what they showed. Beige turtleneck, thrift store blazer, worn shoes. She looked at students like someone searching for something, maybe a crack, maybe a mirror. Susan carried her own scars. At 35, she had seen public schools in the inner cities of 3 different states. She knew the smell of educational abandonment, could recognize the signs of a system that had given up on its own students. But she also knew that, amid the chaos, there was always a spark waiting to be ignited. David crossed paths with her in the hallway. She smiled. He looked away, uncomfortable. But something in him trembled. As if that smile was meant just for him. "Are you sure you want this?" asked the principal, raising an eyebrow and gesturing toward the 10th grade classroom, known as the problem class. "Everyone deserves a chance," Susan said, adjusting her glasses firmly. He laughed loudly, looking around as if expecting an audience. "Then good luck with David. Even his mom doesn't want to know about him anymore." Susan didn't respond. She just took a deep breath and entered the classroom. The noise ceased like a faucet being turned off. Suspicious looks. David, as always, with his feet up on the desk, chewing something and pretending disinterest. But his eyes were alert. "Good morning," she said with a firm voice. My name is Susan. And I didn't come here to survive. I came to teach. Nobody responded. But a different feeling hung in the air. David, with a crooked smile, said, Yo guys, another one to quit in 3 days. She smiled back. A smile from someone who knows more than they show. And at that moment, he didn't know it, but he had already lost control of the situation. In the first class with Susan, the students were restless. But David was the epicenter of chaos. He threw paper balls when she turned her back. Mocking comments escaped every 3 sentences she spoke. Most laughed. She pretended to ignore it. But Susan was watching. Every move, every word, every reaction. She noticed that David only created trouble when he felt threatened by some deeper question. When the subject stayed superficial, he got bored and stopped disrupting. It was a complex dance. He tested her limits. She studied his patterns. At one point, while writing on the board, he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Ugly handwriting, huh? Looks like she learned yesterday. Laughter echoed. But Susan turned slowly, without losing her calm. Funny. I thought the same about your last essay. Silence. The entire class froze for a moment. David narrowed his eyes, leaning back in his chair with a defiant smile. Did you actually read it? Yes. And I saw potential. Quite a bit, actually. The class laughed again, this time thinking she was joking. But there was no sarcasm in her voice. Just something nobody there expected, sincerity. The principal, who was watching from the hallway with crossed arms, shook his head with disdain. She's going to fall for the poor kid trap. She has no idea who she's dealing with, he muttered. The following week, Susan corrected the first literature test. The grades were a general disaster. But one in particular hurt more. David received his scribbled paper with a huge 0 in red. He stared at the sheet for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the number. The corner of his mouth trembled. Then he threw the paper on the floor with contempt and stood up abruptly. This is a joke, right? He said, facing Susan. You want to act all nice, then humiliate everyone? The grade is just a snapshot of a moment, David. It doesn't define who you are. But it can show where to improve. He laughed, cynical. Improve? Here? For what? For the trash that's waiting for me out there. Susan took a step forward, without changing her tone. For yourself. Just for yourself. But the damage was done. The class laughed, and David left the room kicking the door. In the hallway, the principal saw him pass and commented, loud enough for Susan to hear. Another normal day with our failure champion. She stood there, her eyes discreetly watering. Not because of the torn paper, but because of the boy everyone had given up on seeing. In the following days, Susan tried to get closer. She created different dynamics, suggested group work, used music, movies, even asked students to write a letter to their future selves. During a creative activity, she noticed that David constantly scribbled in the margins of his notebooks. They weren't random drawings, they were loose words, incomplete verses, phrases that seemed to come straight from the soul. She pretended to correct other work, but was actually deciphering those fragments of hidden genius. Some got interested. Others didn't. David, even less so. In one of the activities, she asked each student to share something they liked to do outside school. David responded with a grunt. Reading, he said, dryly. She widened her eyes a little. It was the first time he had said something without irony. What kind of reading? Rap lyrics. She smiled. Modern poetry. He looked away. The next day, she brought a book of poems by Langston Hughes and placed it on his desk. He pushed it back with the tip of his pencil. I don't need your pity. It's not pity. It's opportunity. Same thing. Just different name. The class laughed, but she didn't. The principal passed by in the hallway again. Seeing the scene, he commented to another teacher. I bet next week she'll be asking for a transfer. In the classroom, Susan collected the book without saying a word. But inside, something was strengthening. She still didn't know how, but she wasn't going to give up on him. She just didn't imagine that change would begin in the most unpredictable way possible. Tension accumulated like a pressure cooker. And the burst came on a rainy Tuesday morning. The class began with a discussion about text interpretation. Susan had chosen a sensitive chronicle about abandonment and forgiveness. David didn't even pretend to be listening. He had his headphones on, scribbling in his notebook. But Susan knew he was listening to every word. The scribbles became more intense when the text touched on sensitive points. The pen pressed the paper harder when she mentioned family rejection. "David," she called gently, "can you share your reading with the class?" He took off his headphones slowly, staring at her with silent anger. "I am reading, duh. You want me to draw it? Can you show your notebook, then?" He hesitated for a second longer than usual. But instead, he slammed the notebook shut and stood up abruptly, pushing the chair that fell with a crash. "Enough. What do you want to turn me into, huh? You want me to become your little success project, is that it?" Everyone fell silent. Rain drummed against the windows. The light flickered. "I'm not anyone's experiment. Got it? Nobody cares about me, not my mom, not my dad, not this shitty school. Stop trying to fix what can't be fixed." He was panting. His face red, fists clenched. Susan, motionless, looked directly into his eyes. The entire class held its breath. She took a step forward. "I was also discarded," she said in a low tone. "For years. Until someone showed me I wasn't just a mistake." David blinked. His chest still rose and fell. But the silence was different this time. It wasn't fear. It was something new. Uncomfortable. He left the classroom, but didn't slam the door. Susan breathed deeply. She knew she had touched something, and that now she couldn't go back. That night, alone at home, Susan took an old notebook from a box. The pages were yellowed. Crooked scribbles, insecure letters. Poems that spoke of rejection, fear, anger, exactly like the ones David wrote. She leafed through the pages carefully, as if touching the past with her fingertips. At the bottom of the last page was the name, Susan, 1998. At 17, she had been exactly like David. Rebellious, lost, convinced that the world had no place for her. Until Mrs. Johnson appeared in her life, a simple woman who saw something beyond the facade of anger and desperation. The sound of rain returned like a sound memory. She remembered the teacher who gave her that first encouragement, and how that had saved her life, even though nobody knew. The next day, she arrived early. She discreetly placed a manila envelope on David's desk. He arrived as always, hoodie, headphones, indifferent look. But he noticed the envelope. He opened it without haste, and inside were copies of Susan's poems from her notebook, with a note. "Writing is transforming pain into voice. This was mine. I want to know yours." David looked toward the classroom door. Susan wasn't there yet. He read another poem. Then another. His fingers trembled slightly. One of the poems talked about feeling invisible in your own home. Another, about the feeling of not belonging anywhere. They were verses that could have come from his own hand. At the bottom of his backpack, he looked for the notebook he never showed anyone. He flipped through the pages. He stopped at one. With a pen, he began rewriting one of the lyrics, cleaner, more decided. He didn't know why. But for the first time, he wanted someone to understand. The following week arrived with something nobody expected, silence. Not a tense silence, like before, but a curious silence. David was quieter. He still didn't participate, still mocked from time to time, but something in his posture had changed. He arrived on time. He took more care of his notebook. Sometimes, he looked at Susan for more than 3 consecutive seconds, without anger, without sarcasm. During a class about figures of speech, he muttered something about metaphors in rap music. Susan pretended not to hear, but developed the topic, showing how urban poetry used resources similar to the classics. David didn't comment anymore, but his eyes followed every word. On a Wednesday, Susan proposed a new activity. "Let's set up a small poetry reading. A word mural. Anyone who wants can write something, a poem, a rap, a letter. The theme is, what nobody sees." Some students mocked. Others laughed. But on Friday, when the mural was already mounted in the hallway, something appeared taped there, with transparent tape and firm handwriting. Nobody sees what bleeds in silence. Nobody hears who screams inside. But there's someone who reads what the world ignores and transforms rage into movement. David S. The school stopped. Some mocked, others were shocked. But nobody denied it was powerful and real. At the back of the classroom, the principal entered with an angry face. Susan knew it was a matter of time before he reacted. During breaks, other students began looking for David. Not to provoke or mock, but to ask how he wrote like that. Some even asked for help with essays. In that afternoon's faculty meeting, the principal was direct. This place is becoming a circus. Students are getting all artsy, and now we have a hallway poet? It's expression. It's the beginning of a path, Susan said. It's romanticizing problems. It's not a school's job to applaud delinquents. The room fell silent. But Susan held his gaze. It's a school's job to recognize humanity. Because if we don't do that, who will? The principal left the meeting without responding. The next day, David arrived at class holding a different notebook. It was new, with a plain black cover. He discreetly handed it to Susan at the beginning of class. She opened it and found several lyrics, poems, reflections, loose phrases. But on the last page was the most impactful. When nobody sees, she saw. When everyone laughed, she stayed. There was also a longer text, a kind of confession about his childhood, absent parents, the feeling of having no value. And at the end, a question that pierced Susan's heart: is it too late to start believing in myself? At that moment, the principal entered the classroom. Susan, I need you for a moment, he said, looking directly at the notebook. David stared at him. The principal frowned. You think this is a talent show? This is a school. Susan stood up calmly. But before leaving, she said, and that's why the school is the way it is. The silence was absolute. David, for the first time, didn't lower his head. He looked at the principal firmly. There was no hatred. There was presence. The class didn't know yet, but something much bigger had just happened there. During the week of the semester's closing event, Susan suggested that the poetry reading be presented to the entire school. The principal immediately refused. This will become chaos. Nobody wants to see these kids crying in verse. But something happened. Other teachers, previously apathetic, began to get interested. A group of 12th grade students offered help. Even the security guards collaborated. News of the poetry reading spread through the school like wildfire. Students from other classes asked if they could participate. Staff offered to help with organization. Even parents began showing up, curious about this different event. And then, against all predictions, the poetry reading happened. In the gym, with microphone, hanging posters and late afternoon light streaming through the roof cracks. The environment was transformed. Where before there was only echo of screams and confusion, now voices loaded with emotion, truth, recovered hope resonated. David was the last to present. He climbed onto the improvised stage with a black notebook in his hands. His voice trembled, but his eyes were focused. He began to recite a text about invisibility, about abandonment, and about being seen by someone. I was the echo of a mute scream, the shadow of who never was. Until someone stopped in the darkness and said, I see who you are. The silence was absolute. At the end, a shy clap. Then another. And then, unanimous applause. Among the faces, Susan smiled, eyes watering. The principal, in the back, motionless, stared at David expressionless. But there, in that applause, the entire school saw what he tried to hide for years, that inside that difficult student, there was a complete human being. The following Monday, something different happened in the courtyard. David was helping a younger student with a language arts assignment. They were sitting on the ground, laughing at something he was reading aloud. A security guard passed by and stopped to look. She smiled. Said nothing. Other students began looking for him. Not out of fear or to tease, but because they wanted to learn to write like him. They wanted to discover how to transform anger into art. Susan watched from the second-floor balcony. The light breeze messed with her hair. She held the same notebook, now with new filled pages. In the faculty room, comments changed tone. Before it was waste of time. Now it was "this is what school should be." The principal passed by her in the hallway and for the first time, said nothing sarcastic. He just nodded silently. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't explicit recognition. But it was finally respect. David still had his difficult days. But something in him had realigned. Like a door that opens and never closes the same way again. He began organizing creative writing workshops for other students. On Thursday afternoons, Susan's classroom transformed into a small dream laboratory, where young people who thought they were lost discovered they had a voice. In the last class of the semester, Susan wrote on the board, "Sometimes we just need someone to see who we are, before the world erases us." The class was silent for a few seconds, absorbing the phrase. Then they began packing their backpacks, some commenting that it was cool, others pretending disinterest, but with different looks. David was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, turned around and said, "Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Really." She smiled, holding back tears. "Keep writing, David. Your words have power." He nodded and left. The hallway was empty, but light entered through the windows with a soft, almost symbolic brightness. Susan stood there, alone, but complete. It was late afternoon. The sun slowly descended behind the school building, tinting the old walls with golden and orange tones. The windows reflected light like broken mirrors, scattering brightness through the hallway. In the empty classroom, Susan slowly erased the board. The last chalk marks disappeared under the damp sponge. With each movement she breathed deeply, as if washing not only the board, but also the marks of months of invisible struggle. Outside, footsteps echoed through the hallway. David passed by the open door, said nothing. But he left something on the desk before going. Susan finished cleaning, turned around, and saw a note, carefully folded. She opened it. "You were the only one who saw what I didn't even know existed. Now I see too. And I'm going to teach others to see. The cycle doesn't end here. D." Susan smiled, with watery eyes. She looked out the window. Outside, David walked slowly through the courtyard, with a black notebook under his arm and straighter shoulders. He didn't look back. But she knew, he knew. Next to him, two younger students were asking questions about poetry. And he answered with patience, with the same care she had once shown. The camera slowly pulls away, showing the classroom, the school, the city in the background. And then the final narration. Sometimes, all it takes is a look that believes, when nobody else believes anymore. And that look changes everything. But the most beautiful thing is when the one who is seen learns to see others. That's how a school transforms. That's how a world rebuilds itself. One look at a time.